Welcome back to Sleepless History. I'm your host, and I'm glad you've joined me again as we continue our long, peaceful exploration of Persia. If part 1 was the introduction to the Iranian plateau, tonight is about turning the page to the next major chapter. This is still the place to let your mind wander. The details remain rich, but the pace is deliberately slow and steady, perfect for those late nights when sleep feels just out of reach. Take a moment to get settled in. Find that perfect position, let the room grow dark, and let the gentle sounds guide you. We're travelling forward through the centuries, continuing the story of this continuous civilization. We'll move deliberately, letting the rise and fall of ancient kings and empires unfold slowly, like a dream. Remember, we're here to meander, to take our time and let the great weight of history settle in a comforting way. So close your eyes if you'd like, listen to the rhythm of the words, and let's resume our calming journey into ancient Persia. Part 11. The Seleucid and Parthian Periods. After Alexander's death in 323 before the Common Era, his empire was divided among his generals. The eastern territories, including most of the former Persian Empire, fell to Seleucus I, one of Alexander's most capable commanders. Seleucus founded the Seleucid Empire, which would control much of the Middle East for the next 2 centuries. The Seleucids were Greeks, and they brought Greek culture and language to the east. Cities were founded along Greek lines, with gymnasiums, theatres and temples to Greek gods. Greek settlers were encouraged to move to the east, and Greek became the language of administration and culture. This period, known as the Hellenistic Age, saw a blending of Greek and Eastern cultures. But the Seleucid Empire was vast and difficult to control. It stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, and it faced constant challenges from external enemies and internal revolts. Over time, the Seleucids lost control of the eastern provinces, and the empire shrank. One of the peoples who broke away from Seleucid control were the Parthians. The Parthians were an Iranian people, originally from the northeastern part of the Iranian plateau. In the mid-3rd century before the Common Era, a Parthian chieftain named Arsaces led a successful revolt against the Seleucids and established an independent Parthian kingdom. Under Arsaces and his successors, the Parthian kingdom expanded, gradually conquering more and more of the Iranian plateau. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Parthians controlled most of what had been the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid Empire after its founder, would last for nearly 500 years, from about 250 before the Common Era to 224 of the Common Era. It was one of the great powers of the ancient world, rivaling Rome in the west and China in the east. The Parthians were known for their cavalry, particularly their horse archers, who could shoot arrows while riding at full gallop and even while retreating. The famous Parthian shot shooting backward while riding away became a metaphor for a parting attack. In 53 before the Common Era, the Parthians inflicted one of the worst defeats in Roman history at the Battle of Carrhae. A Roman army of about 40,000 men, led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome, invaded Parthian territory. The Parthian general Sharina met them with a much smaller force, composed primarily of horse archers. The Romans, expecting a traditional battle, formed up in their standard formations, but the Parthians refused to engage in close combat. Instead, They rode in circles around the Romans, shooting arrows continuously. The Romans, weighed down by their heavy armor and unable to close with the enemy, were slaughtered. Crassus was killed, and his head was brought to the Parthian king. According to legend, molten gold was poured into Crassus's mouth in mockery of his legendary greed. The defeat at Carrhae established the Euphrates River as the boundary between Rome and Parthia, a boundary that would endure for centuries. The Parthians, however, were not interested in building a centralized empire like the Achaemenids. The Parthian Empire was more of a confederation, with semi-independent kingdoms and vassal states paying tribute to the Parthian king, but largely governing themselves. This made the empire flexible, but also vulnerable to internal divisions. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Parthians fought a series of wars with Rome, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Parthian armies occasionally invaded Roman territory, and Roman armies occasionally invaded Parthia, but neither empire could conquer the other. By the early 3rd century of the Common Era, the Parthian Empire was weakening. Internal strife and constant warfare with Rome had drained its resources, and in the province of Persis, in the Iranian heartland, a new power was rising. Part 12. The Sasanian Empire. In 224 of the Common Era, a local king in Persis named Ardashir, a descendant of a priest named Sasan, rebelled against the Parthian king. Ardashir defeated the Parthians in battle, killed the last Parthian king Artabanus IV, and proclaimed himself the King of Kings, reviving the ancient Achaemenid title. Thus began the Sasanian Empire, the last great pre-Islamic Persian empire. The Sasanians ruled for over 400 years, from 224 to 651 of the Common Era. Ardashir and his successors saw themselves as the true heirs of the Achaemenids, restoring Persian greatness after centuries of foreign rule. They revived Zoroastrianism as the state religion and promoted Persian culture and language. The Sasanian Empire was more centralized than the Parthian Empire had been. The Sasanian kings exercised direct control over their territories, appointing governors and officials who answered directly to the crown. They also created an efficient bureaucracy and a standing army. The Sasanians fought numerous wars with Rome, and later with the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to Rome. The frontier between the two empires shifted back and forth, but neither could decisively defeat the other. These wars were enormously costly for both sides, and drained the resources of both empires. One of the most famous Sasanian kings was Shapur I, who ruled from 240 to 270. Shapur fought several successful campaigns against Rome. In 260, he even captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. According to later tradition, Shapur used Valerian as a footstool when mounting his horse. Shapur commemorated his victories in a series of rock reliefs carved into cliff faces at Nakhshe Rustam and other sites. These reliefs show Shapur on horseback receiving the submission of defeated Roman emperors. They're among the most impressive works of Sasanian art and can still be seen today. Another notable Sasanian king was Khosrow I, also known as Khosrow Anushirvan, or Khosrow the Immortal Soul, who ruled from 531 to 579. Khosrow is remembered as a wise and just ruler, a patron of learning and the arts. During his reign, the Sasanian Empire reached its greatest cultural and economic heights. Khosrow reformed the tax system, making it more equitable and efficient. He promoted agriculture through irrigation projects. He patronized scholars and invited Greek philosophers who had been exiled from the Byzantine Empire to his court. Works of Greek philosophy, science, and medicine were translated into Persian and Syriac, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Sasanian period saw a flowering of Persian culture. Epic poetry, religious texts, and historical chronicles were composed. The Book of Kings, or Shahnameh, the great Persian epic composed by the poet Ferdowsi in the 10th century, draws heavily on stories and legends from the Sasanian period and earlier. But by the early 7th century, the Sasanian Empire was in decline. A long and destructive war with the Byzantine Empire, lasting from 602 to 628, exhausted both empires. The Sasanian king Khosrow II conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, even threatening Constantinople itself. But the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius counterattacked, invading Persia and defeating the Sasanians in a series of battles. Khosrow II was overthrown and murdered by his own son in 628. The empire then descended into civil war with multiple claimants to the throne. Between 628 and 632, there were at least 10 different rulers, each with a tenuous claim to power. The Sasanian Empire was on the verge of collapse, and at that moment a new force appeared on the scene. A force that would sweep away not only the Sasanian Empire, but also transform the entire region. That force was Islam. Part 13. The Arab Conquest and the End of Ancient Persia. In 632 of the Common Era, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina, in what is now Saudi Arabia. He had spent the last decade of his life uniting the Arabian tribes under the banner of Islam, a new monotheistic religion. After his death, his successors the caliphs continued the expansion of the Islamic State. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, sent armies north out of Arabia into Byzantine, Syria, and Sasanian Mesopotamia. These were initially raids, intended to gain plunder and assert dominance. But the Arabs quickly discovered that both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were weak, exhausted from their long wars with each other. In 636, at the Battle of Qadisiyah, an Arab army defeated a much larger Sasanian force. The battle lasted several days, and the casualties were enormous on both sides. But in the end, the Arabs were victorious. The road to the Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon lay open. Ctesiphon, located on the Tigris River near modern Baghdad, was one of the great cities of the world, wealthy and magnificent. When the Arabs captured it in 637, they found treasures beyond imagination: gold, silver, jewels, silk carpets, and fine furnishings. The Arabs, coming from the austere desert, were astounded by the opulence. But the fall of Ctesiphon did not end Sasanian resistance. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward, attempting to raise new armies. For the next 14 years, he moved from city to city, always one step ahead of the Arab armies, trying desperately to organize resistance. The decisive battle came in 642 at Nahavand in western Iran. A Sasanian army perhaps the last that the empire could field, met an Arab force. Once again, the Arabs were victorious. The battle was so catastrophic for the Persians that it became known in Arabic tradition as the victory of victories. After Nahavand, Sasanian resistance crumbled. City after city submitted to Arab rule. The great Iranian cities Isfahan, Shiraz, Hamadan fell one by one. Yazdegerd fled further east into Khorasan, but he found no safety there. In 651, he was murdered by a local miller, some say for the clothes on his back. With Yazdegerd's death, the Sasanian Empire came to an end. The ancient civilization of Persia, which had endured for over a millennium in various forms Achaemenid, Parthian, Sasanian, was no more. The Iranian plateau was now part of the Islamic world. But Persian culture did not die, far from it. Over the coming centuries, the Persians would play a crucial role in shaping Islamic civilization, contributing their language, their administrative traditions, their art and architecture, their poetry and philosophy. The story of Persia does not end with the Arab conquest. In many ways, it was just beginning a new chapter, but that chapter takes us beyond ancient history and into the medieval and modern periods. For now, let us pause and reflect on what we have covered. We have journeyed through thousands of years, from the earliest settlements on the Iranian plateau to the fall of the Sasanian Empire. We have seen the rise and fall of great empires, the deeds of legendary kings, the clash of civilizations. It is a story of continuity and change, of resilience and adaptation. The Persians, through all the conquests and transformations, maintained a distinct identity, a proud sense of their heritage. Part 14. Reflections on Persian Civilization. Let us take a moment to consider the broader themes of Persian history. What made Persian civilization unique? What were its lasting contributions? One of the most distinctive features of the Persian empires was their approach to governance. Unlike many ancient empires, which ruled through fear and oppression, the Persians, particularly under the Achaemenids, practiced a form of enlightened imperialism. They respected local customs and religions. They allowed subject peoples to govern themselves according to their own traditions, as long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Persian supremacy. This policy was not merely altruistic, it was pragmatic. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching across different peoples, languages, and cultures. Attempting to impose uniformity would have been impossible and would have provoked constant rebellions. By allowing diversity, the Persians created a stable empire that endured for centuries. The Achaemenids also developed an efficient system of communication and administration. The royal road, the network of rest stations, the satrapy system, the use of standardized coinage, all of these innovations helped to bind the empire together and facilitate trade and communication across enormous distances. Another important aspect of Persian civilization was Zoroastrianism. This ancient religion, with its emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, its belief in a single supreme God, and its ethical teachings, had a profound influence not only on Persian culture, but also on other religions. Many scholars believe that Zoroastrian concepts influenced the development of Judaism, particularly during the Babylonian exile, when the Jews lived under Persian rule. Ideas about angels and demons, about heaven and hell, about a final judgment and the resurrection of the dead, All of these, which became central to Judaism and later to Christianity and Islam, may have been influenced by Zoroastrian thought. Persian art and architecture also left a lasting legacy. The massive stone platforms and columned halls of Persepolis, the intricate stone reliefs depicting kings and tribute bearers, the synthesis of artistic styles from across the empire, these set a standard for monumental architecture that influenced later Islamic and Western traditions. Persian literature and poetry, though much of the earliest material is lost, would flower in the Islamic period. The great Persian poets Ferdowsi, Rumi, Hafez, Sa'di created works of timeless beauty that are still read and cherished today. The stories and legends of pre-Islamic Persia, preserved in the Shahnameh and other texts, became part of the cultural heritage not just of Iran, but of the wider Islamic world. Even after the Arab Conquest, Persian identity persisted. The Persian language, adapted to Arabic script, became one of the great languages of Islamic civilization, used from Turkey to India. Persian administrative traditions influenced the organization of Islamic caliphates and sultanates. Persian artistic styles shaped Islamic art and architecture. In a sense, the Persians conquered their conquerors culturally. The Arabs brought Islam, but the Persians shaped how Islam was practiced and expressed in much of the Eastern Islamic world. Part 15. Daily Life in Ancient Persia. We have spent much time talking about kings and battles, empires rising and falling, but what was life like for ordinary people in ancient Persia? Let us slow down and try to imagine the daily rhythms of life on the Iranian plateau. For most people, life was agricultural. The majority of the population were farmers, living in small villages, working the land much as their ancestors had for thousands of years. They grew wheat and barley, the staple grains. They cultivated grapes, which were made into wine, a beverage enjoyed by all classes of Persian society. They grew pomegranates, figs, dates. They kept sheep and goats for meat, milk, and wool. The rhythm of life was determined by the seasons. Spring was the time of planting. Summer was the time of growth, of tending the crops, of irrigation. The Iranian plateau is largely arid, so water was precious. Farmers dug qanat, underground channels that brought water from the mountains to the fields. Some of these qanats, remarkably, are still in use today, thousands of years after they were first dug. Autumn was the time of harvest, of gathering in the grain, of pressing the grapes. It was a time of hard work, but also of celebration, of festivals, thanking the gods for the bounty of the earth. Winter was a time of rest, of staying indoors, of storytelling around the fire. The winters on the Iranian plateau can be harsh, with snow in the mountains and cold winds sweeping across the plains. In the cities, life was more varied. There were merchants and craftsmen, soldiers and scribes, priests and officials. The cities were centers of trade, where goods from across the empire and beyond were bought and sold. Silk from China, spices from India, metals from the mountains, grain from the fertile valleys, all passed through the markets of the great Persian cities. The wealthy lived in large houses with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard often contained a garden with a pool or fountain. Water, always precious in the arid climate, was a symbol of wealth and status. The Persian garden, with its geometric layout, its trees and flowers, its carefully managed water features, became a model that influenced garden design throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The very word paradise comes from the Persian word paradisa, meaning an enclosed garden. The poor lived in much more modest dwellings, often just a single room or two built of mud brick. But even the poorest homes would have a courtyard, a place where family life centered, where cooking was done, where children played. Family life was central to Persian culture. The family was the basic unit of society, and loyalty to family was paramount. Marriage was an alliance between families as much as between individuals. Children were cherished and valued, especially sons, who would carry on the family name and inherit the property. Women in Persian society had a complex status. They were not equal to men, but they had more rights and freedoms than women in some other ancient societies. Royal women, in particular, could wield considerable power. We have already mentioned Parysatis, the wife of Darius II, who played a major role in court politics. Atossa, the wife of Darius the Great, was similarly influential. Ordinary women managed their households, raised children, and often participated in economic activities, particularly weaving and textile production. Women of the upper classes were sometimes educated, able to read and write, and could own property in their own right. Religion permeated daily life. The Persians were a pious people, deeply aware of the spiritual dimension of existence. Zoroastrianism taught that the world was a battleground between Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom and Goodness, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of evil and chaos. Humans, through their thoughts, words, and deeds, participated in this cosmic struggle. The Zoroastrian emphasis on personal responsibility, on choosing good over evil, shaped Persian ethics. Truthfulness was highly valued. Lying was considered one of the greatest sins. Loyalty, courage, hospitality, these were virtues celebrated in Persian culture. Religious rituals marked the passage of time. Fire temples, where sacred fires burned continuously, were centers of worship. Fire was sacred to Zoroastrians, a symbol of divine presence and purity. Priests, called magi, the origin of our word magic, tended the fires and performed rituals. Important moments in life, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, were marked by religious ceremonies. Death, in particular, had elaborate rituals. Because earth, water, and fire were all considered sacred and should not be polluted, Zoroastrians did not bury their dead or cremate them. Instead, they exposed the bodies in structures called dakmas, or towers of silence, where vultures and other scavengers would consume the flesh. The bones were then collected and placed in ossuaries. This practice may seem strange or even shocking to modern sensibilities, but it made perfect sense within the Zoroastrian worldview. The body, once the soul had departed, was merely matter, and disposing of it in a way that did not pollute the sacred elements was a religious duty. Food was an important part of life, as it is in all cultures. The Persians enjoyed a varied diet. Meat was eaten, particularly lamb and goat, though it was relatively expensive and not consumed daily by the poor. Fish from the rivers and the Caspian Sea was also eaten. Bread was the staple food, eaten at every meal. Various types of bread were made, from flatbreads to leavened loaves. Rice, which would later become central to Persian cuisine, was introduced relatively late, probably during the Parthian or Sasanian periods. Fruit was abundant, and the Persians were skilled horticulturists. They cultivated many varieties of fruit trees and developed techniques for grafting and irrigation that maximized yields. Wine was the usual beverage for those who could afford it. The Persians were famous or infamous, depending on one's perspective, for their love of wine. Greek writers often commented on Persian drinking habits, sometimes with disapproval, sometimes with envy. Banquets were important social occasions, opportunities for the wealthy to display their status, and for the king to reward his nobles. These banquets could be elaborate affairs, with multiple courses, entertainment, and copious amounts of wine. Hunting was a favourite pastime of the Persian nobility. The king and his nobles hunted lions, bears, wild boar, and deer. Hunting was not just sport, it was also a way of demonstrating martial valour and physical prowess. The kings kept hunting parks called paradises, where game was bred and maintained for royal hunts. Music and dance were also important parts of Persian culture. Musicians played various instruments: lyres, harps, flutes, drums. Dancing was performed at celebrations and festivals. Unfortunately, no written music from ancient Persia survives, so we can only imagine what it sounded like. Storytelling was a cherished art. Professional storytellers would recount tales of ancient heroes, of kings and queens, of battles and romances. Many of these stories were eventually written down and became part of the Shahnameh and other works of literature. Education, for those who could afford it, consisted of learning to read and write, to do arithmetic, to memorize religious texts and cultural traditions. Boys of the noble class also received training in riding, archery, and other martial skills. The Persian boys, according to Herodotus, were taught 3 things: to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to tell the truth. This simple formula captures something essential about Persian values: martial prowess, practical skills, and ethical conduct. Part 16. The Persian Military and Warfare. The military power of the Persian Empire was legendary. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But numbers alone do not explain Persian military success. Organization, logistics, and a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics were equally important. The core of the Persian army was the infantry. The most famous unit was the Immortals, the elite guard of 10,000 men. They were called Immortals because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. If a man was killed or too badly wounded to fight, he was immediately replaced, so the unit always appeared to be at full strength, as if its members were immortal. The Immortals were heavily armed with spears, bows, swords, and daggers. They wore elaborate uniforms with colourful robes and carried large wicker shields. They were the best trained and most disciplined troops in the empire, and they formed the core of the royal bodyguard. But the bulk of the Persian army consisted of levies from the various provinces of the empire. Each satrapy was required to provide a certain number of troops when called upon. These troops were equipped and fought according to their own traditions. Medes and Persians fought as heavy infantry with spears and bows. Bactrians and Scythians were horse archers. Indians brought elephants. Ethiopians carried bows and wore leopard and lion skins. This diversity was both a strength and a weakness. It gave the Persian army flexibility and access to a wide range of military capabilities, but it also created challenges in terms of coordination and communication. The Persians were particularly famous for their cavalry. The Iranian plateau was horse country, and the Persians had been horsemen since time immemorial. They bred excellent horses and trained skilled riders. Persian cavalry could charge with devastating effect, and they could also harass enemy formations with showers of arrows. The Parthians, centuries later, would perfect the technique of mounted archery, creating the famous Parthian shot. But even in the Achaemenid period, Persian cavalry was formidable. The Persians also made use of chariots, though by the 5th century before the Common Era, chariots were becoming obsolete on the battlefield. They were impressive to look at and could be effective against undisciplined infantry, but they were vulnerable to well-trained troops and difficult terrain. Siege warfare was another Persian specialty. The Persians developed sophisticated techniques for attacking fortified cities. They used battering rams to break down gates, siege towers to scale walls, and tunneling to undermine fortifications. They also understood the importance of cutting off a city's water supply and starving it into submission. But perhaps the most important aspect of Persian military power was logistics. Supplying and moving an army of hundreds of thousands of men over vast distances was an enormous challenge. The Persians developed an efficient system of supply depots, standardized rations, and organized transport. The royal road and other routes were not just for communication, they were also military highways, allowing armies to move quickly from one part of the empire to another. Way stations provided food, water, and shelter for troops on the march. The Persian navy, particularly under the Achaemenids, was also significant. The Persians themselves were not seafarers. The Iranian plateau is landlocked, but they had access to the naval resources of their subject peoples. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, and others provided ships and crews for the Persian fleet. At its height, the Persian navy could muster over 1,000 ships. This fleet allowed the Persians to project power across the eastern Mediterranean and to threaten the Greek islands and mainland. But Persian military might was not invincible, as the Greeks proved at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. The Persian defeat in Greece was a turning point, the first major setback for the empire. It revealed vulnerabilities over extended supply lines, difficulties in coordination, the challenge of fighting far from the Persian heartland. Yet the Persian military remained formidable for centuries to come. The Parthian and Sasanian armies continued to hold their own against Rome and Byzantium, two of the most powerful military states in history. Part 17, Persian Art and Architecture. If you visit the ruins of Persepolis today, even after 25 centuries, even in their current state of ruin, you cannot help but be impressed. The scale of the construction, the precision of the stonework, the beauty of the carvings all testify to the skill and ambition of the ancient Persians. The platform on which Persepolis was built is itself an engineering marvel. It's a massive artificial terrace, measuring about 450 meters by 300 meters, roughly 1,500 feet by 1,000 feet, and rising about 15 meters or 50 feet above the surrounding plain. The platform was constructed of massive limestone blocks, fitted together so precisely that no mortar was needed. On this platform stood the palaces and halls. The Apadana, the great audience hall built by Darius I, could accommodate 10,000 people. Its roof was supported by 72 columns, each nearly 20 meters or 65 feet tall. 13 of these columns still stand today, soaring into the sky, topped by elaborate capitals in the form of bullheads. The columns at Persepolis were influenced by Egyptian and Greek architecture, but developed into a distinctly Persian style. They were tall and slender, giving a sense of lightness despite their massive size. The capitals were carved with intricate detail, showing bulls, lions, and mythical creatures. The walls and staircases were decorated with relief carvings. These reliefs are among the masterpieces of ancient art. They depict processions of tribute bearers from all the nations of the empire, each group shown with realistic detail, wearing their traditional costumes and carrying their characteristic gifts. There are Babylonians bringing textiles, Lydians bringing bowls of precious metal, Bactrians leading camels, Ethiopians bringing ivory. There are Armenians with their horses, Cappadocians with their fine steeds, Aracosians from the Far East. Each figure is carved with care, each face individual, each gesture natural. These reliefs served a political purpose. They were meant to demonstrate the extent and diversity of the Persian Empire, to show that all the peoples of the known world acknowledged the supremacy of the Persian king. But they also have an artistic value that transcends their propaganda function. They're beautiful works of art in their own right. The Persians also excelled in smaller scale arts. Gold and silver vessels, intricately worked with designs of animals and plants, were prized throughout the ancient world. Persian textiles, though few have survived, were famous for their quality and beauty. Persian carpets and tapestries were sought after from Greece to China. The Persians were also skilled in working with glazed bricks and tiles. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, reconstructed by the Babylonians under Persian rule, gives us a sense of this art. The gate was covered with glazed bricks in brilliant blues, yellows and whites, forming images of bulls, lions and dragons. Similar techniques were used in Persian palaces. At Susa, the palace walls were decorated with glazed brick friezes showing the royal guard, rows of archers in colourful uniforms, striding along with their spears and bows. These friezes, now in museums in Paris and other cities, still glow with vivid colour after more than 2,000 years. Persian architecture also included innovations in vault and dome construction. The Parthians and Sasanians developed the Iwan, a large vaulted hall open on one side. This architectural form would become central to Islamic architecture, used in mosques, palaces, and caravanserais throughout the Islamic world. The Sasanians also built impressive palaces. The Palace of Ctesiphon featured an enormous Iwan, the Tak Kasra, which spanned about 25 meters 82 feet without any supporting columns. The vaulted ceiling, made of baked bricks, rose to a height of about 37 meters or 120 feet. Though the palace is now in ruins, the Great Iwan still stands, a testament to Sasanian engineering. Persian art was not just decorative. It expressed ideas about kingship, about the relationship between the divine and the human, about the order and harmony that the king was supposed to maintain in the world. The king was shown as larger than ordinary mortals, serene and powerful. He was depicted hunting lions, symbolizing his role as protector of civilization against chaos. He was shown receiving tribute, symbolizing the submission of all peoples to his authority. Above the king, in many reliefs, hovers the figure of Ahura Mazda, or the Faravahar, the winged symbol associated with Zoroastrianism. This reminded viewers that the king's power came from the gods, that he ruled with divine sanction. Yet despite this emphasis on royal power, Persian art also celebrated the diversity and richness of the empire. The tribute bearers at Persepolis are not shown as abject slaves, but as dignified representatives of their peoples, bringing their finest products as gifts rather than as forced tribute. This tension between imperial dominance and respect for diversity runs through much of Persian culture. It's what made the Persian Empire different from many other ancient empires and contributed to its longevity. Part 18. Science and Learning in Ancient Persia. The ancient Persians were not just warriors and builders, they were also scholars and scientists, contributing to the development of knowledge in various fields. Astronomy was particularly important in Persian culture. The Persians, like other peoples of the ancient Near East, believed that the movements of the stars and planets had significance, that they could influence events on Earth. Astrology and astronomy were closely linked, not yet separated into the distinct fields they would later become. Persian astronomers made careful observations of the heavens. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. They developed calendars based on these observations. The Persian calendar, based on solar year, was more accurate than the lunar calendars used by many other peoples. The Zoroastrian calendar, in particular, was sophisticated. It had 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year to bring the total to 365. This calendar required occasional adjustments to keep it synchronized with the solar year, but it was a significant achievement for its time. Persian astronomers also divided the sky into constellations and named them. Many of these constellations, transmitted through Greek and Arabic sources, are still used today. Mathematics was another field where the Persians made contributions. They developed systems of arithmetic and geometry necessary for architecture, engineering, trade, and taxation. The Qanat system, those underground water channels we mentioned earlier, required sophisticated understanding of surveying and hydraulics. Medicine was also practiced in ancient Persia. Physicians used a combination of herbal remedies, surgery, and what we might call preventive medicine advice about diet, exercise, hygiene. The Zoroastrian religion placed great emphasis on purity and cleanliness, which likely contributed to public health. The Magi, the Zoroastrian priests, were not just religious figures, they were also scholars, learned in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. They served as advisors to kings, as judges, as teachers. The Greek word magos, from which we get magic, originally referred to these Persian priests and their learning. Under the Sasanians, learning flourished even more. The academy at Gundashapur in southwestern Iran became one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world. It included a library, a hospital, and a teaching institution where medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and other subjects were taught. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 of the Common Era, many Greek philosophers fled to Persia and were welcomed at Gundashapur. There, Greek philosophy and science were translated into Persian and Syriac, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Gundishapur's hospital was particularly advanced. It included wards for different types of diseases, a pharmacy, and facilities for teaching medical students. The physicians there practiced based on careful observation and kept records of their cases. This tradition of learning would continue after the Arab Conquest. Many of the scholars and translators who worked in the Great Translation movement of the early Islamic period, when Greek and Persian works were translated into Arabic, were Persians or worked in the Persian tradition. In fact, much of what we know of Greek philosophy and science survived because it was preserved by Persian and later Islamic scholars. When Europeans in the Middle Ages began to recover the works of Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers, they often did so through Latin translations of Arabic translations of Syriac or Persian translations of the original Greek. Part 19. Language and Literature. The Persian language has a long and distinguished history. It belongs to the Indo-European family of languages related to Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and most of the languages of modern Europe. The earliest form of Persian that we can read is Old Persian, the language of the Achaemenid inscriptions. Old Persian was written in a cuneiform script adapted specifically for the Persian language. Unlike other cuneiform scripts, which use hundreds of signs representing syllables or words, Old Persian cuneiform had only about 40 signs, making it much simpler. The Old Persian script was used primarily for royal inscriptions. For everyday administrative purposes, the Achaemenids used Aramaic, a Semitic language that had become the lingua franca of the Near East. Aramaic was written in an alphabetic script, much easier to learn and use than cuneiform. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Greek became the dominant language of administration and culture under the Seleucids. But Persian continued to be spoken by the common people, and under the Parthians, Persian began to reassert itself. Middle Persian, the language of the Parthian and Sasanian periods, was written in an alphabet derived from Aramaic. Numerous texts in Middle Persian survive, including religious works, epic tales, and administrative documents. Unfortunately, much of ancient Persian literature has been lost. The Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, were originally composed and transmitted orally. They were not written down until the Sasanian period, and even then, much was lost. What survives is only a fraction of what once existed. The Avesta includes hymns, prayers, and liturgical texts. The oldest parts are the Gathas, hymns attributed to Zoroaster himself, composed perhaps around 1500 before the Common Era, though the dating is uncertain. The Gathas are written in an ancient form of Persian, difficult to understand, even for later Persian speakers. Other Sasanian texts include historical chronicles, collections of wisdom, literature, and epic tales. These would later be synthesized into the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, by the poet Ferdowsi in the 10th century of the Common Era. The Shahnameh is one of the great works of world literature. It's an epic poem of about 50,000 couplets, recounting the history of Persia from the creation of the world to the Arab Conquest. Ferdowsi drew on earlier sources, now mostly lost, and wove them into a coherent narrative. The Shahnameh includes tales of legendary kings like Jamshid, who brought civilization to humanity, and Zahak, an evil tyrant who had serpents growing from his shoulders. It includes the story of Rostam, the greatest of all heroes, and his tragic confrontation with his son Sohrab. It recounts the wars between Persia and Turan, the land to the north. Though composed centuries after the fall of the Sasanian Empire, the Shahnameh preserved the memory and the spirit of ancient Persia. It became a source of national identity for Persians, a reminder of their glorious past. To this day, Iranians read and memorize passages from the Shahnameh. It's part of the living culture, not just a historical artifact. The Persian language itself evolved over the centuries. After the Arab Conquest, Persian was written in the Arabic script and absorbed many Arabic words, particularly religious and scholarly terms. But the core of the language remained Persian, and it retained its distinct identity. Modern Persian, also known as Farsi, is spoken today in Iran, Afghanistan, where it's called Dari, and Tajikistan, where it's called Tajik. Despite the centuries and the geographical separation, modern Persian speakers can still read and understand classical Persian texts like the Shahnameh, much as English speakers can read Shakespeare. This continuity of language is one of the remarkable features of Persian culture. It connects modern Iranians directly to their ancient past, allowing them to read the words of their ancestors and to feel part of an unbroken tradition stretching back thousands of years. Part 20. Religion and Philosophy in Ancient Persia. We have mentioned Zoroastrianism several times, but let us now examine it more closely. It was the dominant religion of ancient Persia for over 1,000 years, and its influence extends far beyond Persia itself. Zoroastrianism was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, known in Persian as Zarathustra. When he lived is uncertain. Traditional Zoroastrian sources place him 6,000 years before the Common Era, but this is clearly mythological. Modern scholars generally place him sometime between 1500 and 1000 before the Common Era, in the Late Bronze Age or Early Iron Age. Zoroaster was probably a priest in the traditional polytheistic religion of the ancient Iranians, but he had a revelation, a vision of the truth, and he began to preach a new message. At the core of Zoroastrianism is the belief in one supreme God, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. Ahura Mazda is the creator of all that is good. He is opposed by Angra Mainyu, also called Ahriman, the spirit of evil and destruction. These two cosmic forces are locked in an eternal struggle. Humans, according to Zoroaster, have free will. They can choose to align themselves with good or with evil, with Ahura Mazda or with Angra Mainyu. This choice is made through one's thoughts, words, and deeds. The Zoroastrian motto is good thoughts, good words, good deeds. This emphasis on personal choice and moral responsibility is one of the distinctive features of Zoroastrianism. Unlike some religions where one's fate is predetermined, or where salvation depends on the grace of the gods, in Zoroastrianism, each person is responsible for their own spiritual destiny. Zoroastrianism also has an eschatology, a vision of the end times. At the end of the world, there will be a final battle between good and evil. Ahura Mazda will triumph, and evil will be defeated. The dead will be resurrected and judged. The righteous will be rewarded with eternal life in paradise. The wicked will be purified by fire, and then will also enter paradise, for ultimately all of creation will be saved. This vision of a final judgment of resurrection, of heaven and hell was revolutionary. It influenced later religions, particularly Judaism during the Babylonian exile, and through Judaism it influenced Christianity and Islam. Zoroastrian worship centered on fire, which was seen as a symbol of Ahura Mazda's presence and purity. Fire temples, where sacred fires were maintained continuously, were the main places of worship. Priests tended these fires, performing rituals and reciting prayers. Zoroastrians did not build statues of their gods. Ahura Mazda was considered too transcendent to be represented in physical form. This too may have influenced Judaism and Islam, both of which prohibit idolatry. Zoroastrianism also placed great emphasis on purity. Fire, water, and earth were considered sacred elements and were not to be polluted. This led to various purity laws, including the practice of exposing the dead rather than burying or cremating them. Under the Achaemenids, Zoroastrianism became the religion of the Persian elite, though it was not imposed on subject peoples. Under the Sasanians, it became more of a state religion with an organized priesthood and an official orthodoxy. Heretics, including Manichaeans and Christians, were sometimes persecuted. But Zoroastrianism was not the only religion in ancient Persia. Older Iranian deities continued to be worshipped, often syncretized with Zoroastrianism. Mithra, the god of the sun and of contracts, was particularly popular. Mithraism, based on the worship of Mithra, spread throughout the Roman Empire in the first few centuries of the Common Era and became one of Christianity's main rivals. Anahita, the goddess of waters and fertility, was also widely worshipped. The Achaemenid kings built temples to Anahita, and she was invoked in royal inscriptions alongside Ahura, Mazda, and Mithra. After the Arab Conquest, Zoroastrianism declined in Persia as most of the population converted to Islam, either voluntarily or under pressure. But Zoroastrianism did not disappear. A small community remained in Iran, known as Zoroastrians or Zartoshtis. Another community fled to India, where they became known as Parsis. Today, there are perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 Zoroastrians worldwide, most in India and Iran, with smaller communities elsewhere. It's a small number, but the influence of Zoroastrianism on world history has been far greater than these numbers suggest. Part 21. The Legacy of Ancient Persia. As we near the end of our journey through ancient Persian history, let us consider the legacy of this great civilization. What did Persia contribute to the world? How did it shape the course of history? Politically, the Persian Empire set a model for later empires. The idea of a vast, multi-ethnic empire held together by efficient administration, good communications, and respect for local customs, this was the Persian contribution. Alexander the Great adopted this model when he conquered the Persian Empire. The Romans learned from it. Later, Islamic caliphates and the Ottoman Empire followed similar patterns. The Persian satrapy system, with its balance of central authority and local autonomy, influenced governance structures throughout history. The concept of provincial governors with broad powers, supervised by royal inspectors, has echoes in many later administrative systems. Culturally, Persia was a bridge between East and West, between the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the emerging civilizations of Greece and India. Persian art synthesized elements from all these cultures, creating something new and distinctive. This artistic synthesis continued into the Islamic period and influenced art and architecture from Spain to Indonesia. Religiously, Zoroastrianism's influence can be traced in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The concepts of heaven and hell, of angels and demons, of a final judgment and resurrection, all have roots in or were influenced by Zoroastrian thought. The very idea of history as a linear progression toward a final goal, rather than an endless cycle, may owe something to Zoroastrianism. Linguistically, Persian has been one of the great languages of civilization. In the Islamic period, Persian became a language of poetry, philosophy, and science, used alongside Arabic. Many of the greatest works of Islamic literature were written in Persian. From Turkey to India, Persian was the language of courts and culture for centuries. The Persian language also contributed words to many other languages. Words like paradise, magic, bazaar, caravan, shawl, orange, lemon, spinach, jasmine, rose, lilac, and many others entered European languages through Persian. Scientifically, Persian scholars preserved and transmitted knowledge from the ancient world. The academy at Gundashapur and later Persian institutions kept alive Greek philosophy and science during periods when they were neglected in Europe. Persian and later Islamic scholars added their own contributions, and when this knowledge returned to Europe in the Middle Ages, it sparked the Renaissance. Architecturally, Persian innovations like the Iwan, the dome, the garden, influenced building practices across a vast region. The great mosques of the Islamic world, from Cordoba to Delhi, owe much to Persian architectural traditions. Even in small details, Persian influence can be seen. The game of chess, for example, originated in India but was transmitted to the West through Persia. Many of the terms used in chess, checkmate, comes from the Persian phrase Shah Mat, meaning the king is dead, are of Persian origin. Perhaps most importantly, Persia kept alive the memory of a great civilization. Even after the fall of the Sasanians, even after centuries of foreign rule, Persians remembered their past. They told stories of ancient kings and heroes. They recited poetry, celebrating Persian culture and values. This cultural memory sustained them through difficult times and helped to preserve their identity. When Ferdowsi composed the Shahnameh in the 10th century, he was deliberately creating a national epic, reminding Persians of their glorious past. In his introduction, he wrote that he had spent 30 years composing the work, so that the Persian language might live through this work forever. And it has. The Shahnameh remains a living text, read and loved by millions of Persian speakers today. It connects them to their ancestors, to the kings and heroes of ancient times, to a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. This is perhaps Persia's greatest legacy, the example of a civilization that, despite conquest and change, despite the rise and fall of empires, maintained its identity and continued to contribute to human culture. The Persians were conquered by Greeks, by Arabs, by Mongols, by Turks. But Persian culture proved resilient, adapting and surviving, influencing their conquerors even as it was influenced by them. Part 22. The end of our journey. We have travelled a long road together tonight. We began in the mists of prehistory, in the small farming villages of the Iranian plateau 7,000 years ago. We watched as these villages grew into cities, as the Elamites built their civilization, as the Indo-European peoples arrived. We saw the rise of the Medes and the Persians. We watched Cyrus the Great build an empire through conquest and conciliation. We saw Darius organize that empire into an efficient state. We witnessed Xerxes' failed invasion of Greece and the slow decline of the Achaemenid Empire. We saw Alexander sweep through Persia like a whirlwind, ending one era and beginning another. We watched as the Seleucids tried to Hellenize the East and as the Parthians reasserted Iranian culture and identity. We saw the rise of the Sasanians, the last great pre-Islamic Persian Empire. We witnessed their centuries-long struggle with Rome and Byzantium. And finally, we saw the Arab Conquest, which brought an end to ancient Persia, but also the beginning of a new chapter. Throughout this long journey, certain themes emerged. The importance of tolerance and respect for diversity, the value of efficient administration and good governance, the power of culture and language to preserve identity, the resilience of a people who, despite repeated conquest, maintained their sense of who they were. Ancient Persia was not perfect. No civilization is. The Persian Empire was built on conquest. It extracted tribute from subject peoples. It fought wars, sometimes brutal ones. Its rulers could be cruel and despotic. Slavery existed, though perhaps it was less harsh than in some other ancient societies. But the Persian Empire also represented something remarkable, an attempt to create order out of chaos, to unite diverse peoples under a common rule while respecting their differences, to build monuments that would last for ages, to create beauty and preserve knowledge. The ruins of Persepolis still stand, silent witnesses to this ancient grandeur. The columns reach toward the sky. The stone carvings show processions of tribute bearers, each figure distinct, each culture represented. And if you stand there in the late afternoon, as the sun begins to set and the stone glows golden in the fading light, you can almost hear the echoes of ancient voices speaking across the millennia. The history of Persia is the history of human ambition and achievement. It's a story of empire building and empire falling, of kings and conquerors, of poets and prophets. But it's also a story of ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen, merchants and soldiers, women and children living their lives, generation after generation, maintaining traditions and creating culture. Their voices are mostly silent now. The Elamite language is dead. Old Persian is no longer spoken. Even Middle Persian survives only in a few Zoroastrian communities, but the monuments remain. The inscriptions can still be read. The stories are still told. And in Iran today, the Persian language is still spoken by millions. The culture that began thousands of years ago on the Iranian plateau continues, changed but unbroken, a living tradition connecting present to past. And so, our journey through the history of Persia comes to an end. We've covered thousands of years, from the earliest settlements to the Arab conquest. We've met kings and queens, warriors and poets, priests and prophets. I hope this has helped you pass the time, perhaps helped you drift towards sleep. History has a way of putting things in perspective. Our own troubles and worries seem smaller when we contemplate the vast sweep of time, the rise and fall of empires, the countless generations who lived and died before us. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this ongoing story, this great chain of humanity stretching back into the mists of time and forward into the unknown future. Thank you for joining me tonight on Sleepless History. Until next time, good night.